and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, let's start with news that the Penang state government is introducing an initiative to nominate women for the State Legislative Assembly, and this is if there are fewer than 30% female representation among elected Assembly persons. Now, the nomination would be based on the percentage of popular votes won by a party in an election. And the idea is that this will ensure that there will at least be 30% women representation in the State Legislative Assembly in Penang. Quite interesting, instead of having elected Assembly persons, that now they're saying, well, the gender balance is not there, we're just going to nominate someone.
Yeah, this, of course, isn't a particularly original idea, but I think it's Malaysia, and in this case Penang, trying to catch up with the world where there are concerns about the lack of representation of women in certain assemblies. The question is whether a quota system, kind of as it were, women's representation through fiat is the best way to go, because I think we all recognize that part of the problem is really political parties. If political parties don't put up enough women as candidates in elections, then you already have a cascading effect. And once you don't have enough women candidates, then you might find that those who are in fact elected lack representation.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I completely think there are structural issues to female representation in politics or women participation in politics. There are many barriers and hurdles that need to be passed or crossed, but also I think the entire environment is not as conducive for women to be in politics as it is men. We treat our women politicians far differently than we do our male politicians.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there might be actually some factors that inhibit women from participating. That might be one thing. But there's also this sense that maybe because politics in Malaysia is so much about, grabbing resources and positions and titles, and it's less about public service, that men tend to want to dominate that sphere. The question really is whether this will be a form of tokenism or whether it will, in fact, lead to greater respect for women as political leaders. Right. And that's something that perhaps we can only know through testing it out. Well,
I know this is kind of going back to the conversation about quotas, right? And this is that is the idea of this 30% women representation. The idea is to fill that 30% quota, and a lot of women feel that they want to be there by their own merit. But in my personal opinion, I think quotas are a good temporary measure to balance an unlevel playing field. I mean, the idea is to have a quota as a temporary measure for an achievable goal, to perhaps ensure access and equal opportunity and representation, so other women who can see themselves represented and see perhaps a pathway to get there.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, but the unintended consequence might be, say, well, okay, well, if the state already and the laws already provide for 30% women's representation, then we as political parties don't even have to try to put women up as candidates, and the correction will come after the elections through this mechanism. And I think that's where I think you might find that because politics is played in a particular way, that is where you see, women sort of coming in as tokens, and in fact, the law might inhibit genuine women's representation and voices. I don't think Malaysia is so bad in terms of having women, as leaders. We have had some really important women leaders in the past, and not just in politics,
I mean,
but in corporate.
We could do better. We could,
always, yes. But so when you compare us to countries where they far exceeded the 30%, and they, with women prime ministers, cabinets, with more than 50% women. All that, I think, you see in countries where there's already, in a social sense, genuine gender equality.
Well, I'm very curious to see how this initiative is going to work out. So we're going to be keeping a very close eye on the developments in Penang. But for now, we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. After we come back, we're going to be looking at some of the reasons behind vaccine hesitancy. So make sure you stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, welcome back. You're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Now, in trying to understand the reasons behind vaccine hesitancy, we wanted to know more about the kind of misinformation that the public is being exposed to when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, and also what can be done to stop the spread of false narratives. Harris Zainul has been looking into this. He is an analyst at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, and he joins us on the line now. Good evening, Harris. Now, I'm just wondering, how prevalent is COVID-19 vaccination information? Maybe you can help us understand the ways in which we're exposed to it here in Malaysia.
Right. Thanks, Melissa, for the question. I think it's hard to give an exact amount of misinformation that we are seeing, right? Because we don't know what exactly is happening on social media, and even more so on the communication platforms like WhatsApp, right? Because they're encrypted. But I think if we look at it anecdotally, there's a definite increase now as we move towards the discovery and the administration of a COVID-19 vaccine. And I think this really reflects the trend of the infodemic seen so far, right? So if we look at January, for example, we saw a lot of false information going about regarding China and Chinese tourists. And this is in the Malaysian context here. And in March, for example, coinciding with the movement control order, we saw a spike in false information related to what the government is doing. So I think this is a continuation of that trend. So as we move towards the vaccine stage of this pandemic, we are seeing more vaccine-related misinformation. I think how we're exposed to it, yes, there's definitely social media, there's definitely the online websites and all that, but also there could be room for doubts to be raised by the mainstream media, and also the conversations that we have around the dinner table. So for example, if your relative is vaccine hesitant or vaccine denier, then through that physical conversation, it could raise legitimate doubts in your head as well about whether you should get inoculated.
Harris, there's a complexity in this conversation because we're beginning with the assumption that what people feel when they have doubts about the vaccine is based on misinformation, when in fact it could be based on genuine and maybe a scientifically based skepticism about the particular vaccines that have rolled out by particular pharmaceutical companies. It could be that pharmaceutical companies themselves have had many missteps, and when you put together reports of vaccines candidates failing, perhaps a legitimate and reasonable picture or conclusion that someone might come to is that it's not safe at this point in time. I mean, how do you deal with that dimension of the issue? Or have we presumed that everything out there is, in fact, misinformation?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Sharaad, that we shouldn't blame everything on misinformation, right? There are pockets of people who have genuine doubts and concerns about vaccines. And I think this really points to how we need to have a specific approach to target different reasons behind vaccine hesitancy, right? So for example, if someone is trying to profit off selling alternative medicinal cures to apparently cure COVID-19, then perhaps the medical regulatory authorities should clamp down on that, right? But if it's going to be genuine reasons about concerns and doubts like you raised earlier, Sharaad, I think there is a room for more engagement from the government and also the public health authorities to dispel these doubts and concerns, right? So it's all about engaging, I feel, and we shouldn't really essentialize the problem to being due completely to misinformation, although there's a role played by misinformation in all of this.
Just now you brought up that it's not just social media and WhatsApp chat groups, but it's also mainstream media, and I'm curious about that, about the media's role in public health messaging, especially around vaccines. Where do you see the gaps? I mean, where do you see the lapses in reporting, especially when it comes to giving context to scientifically sound reporting?
Yeah, I think to be fair to the mainstream media, right, I think the gaps are quite small and few and far in between. The news articles that I've been consuming, I think those have, even from the local ones, right, they have reflected the nuance pretty well, but I think that best practice should be carried over to the headlines as well. So we know for a fact, right, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, or something that should be encouraged. But we know for a fact that some people don't read beyond the headlines, right? So, for instance, a few days ago, we saw a Malay newspaper with the headline, "Enam maut ujian percubaan vaksin COVID-19," right? 6 died from the COVID-19 vaccination trials. And if you read the article, if you read the full article, the nuance is there. They did highlight that 4 people had died and they were part of the control group who had nothing to do with the vaccines to begin with. And the 2 who died and they had been administered the vaccine, they had died for reasons completely unrelated to the vaccine, right? But that nuance was not reflected in the headline. And I think that's there's room there for the editors and also the newsrooms to actually improve on what they decide to put as their headlines. I mean, clickbait and all that, I understand the need for views, but that really shouldn't be coming at the expense of the public discourse and misleading the public as well.
Harris, you know, I follow you on Twitter, and so I know that you have made many valiant attempts to help clarify what's going on. And there seems to be a range of responses, you know, from what we might think of as the kind of lunatic fringe of the anti-vaxxer movement in Malaysia, you know, that blames everything on Bill Gates and that the vaccine will be a conduit for a chip being inserted into us and so on and so forth, to, you know, to the other side, which might be much more about concerns over the religious, the kosher nature of the vaccine, whether it conforms to religious strictures on what can be taken into our bodies and such. How do you have a sense of where it's much more dominant on the scale of hesitancy, where most people fall? Are they in the lunatic fringe, the anti-Bill Gates types, or are they much more on the kind of religious side where, you know, it's really about maintaining some level of religiosity even in the midst of the pandemic?
You're right. I think, first of all, we shouldn't be calling them lunatic fringe, right? I mean, it's funny and all that, but sometimes these people have genuine concerns about what big government is motivated by. So I think we should understand these concerns and engage them on a level where they would appreciate, for example. When it comes to the religious nature of things, I mean, it cannot be denied that issues about the halal status of a big vaccine, for example, matters a lot to the Muslim population. And I think the religious authorities, JAKIM, etc., they should be coming out with guidelines about what needs to be done and what can be done during this pandemic. But on the balance between which group is bigger, I suspect the conspiracy theorists would be a smaller minority as compared to those who are prioritizing the halal status, which I think is a legitimate concern.
Okay. Do you think that you know, people can be convinced? You talked about leadership, particularly religious leaders. Can people's minds be changed? Can vaccine hesitancy be shifted to perhaps be more, you know, vaccine confident?
I think there are a small set of people who have made up their minds about not being vaccinated, right? And these groups generally, I think also, they are against any types of vaccination, right? So the anti-vaccine groups, it'll be very hard to change their minds, similar to how it's hard to change our minds to not vaccinate, right? So we've made up our minds and basically that's that. But this does not mean that we should not try to engage with them, right?
Yeah, but Harris, so we have a problem here, which is that for the whole process to be effective in the long term, and we're going to suppress the disease, we need to reach a certain level of, you know, of vaccination throughout the country. In fact, perhaps throughout the world. And so, you know, I mean, your personal opinion about the government's decision not to make the vaccination mandatory, which is interesting, and I think would be supported by people who feel that everyone should have their own agency in this. But the downside could be that we won't achieve that 70% level and so on and so forth. Do you think there's a strong argument for making vaccination mandatory?
Right. I think there is an argument that you could make for mandatory vaccination, but I think that shouldn't be our go-to at the outset. I think we need to start with engaging and educating people on the need to inoculate against COVID-19. And that should be the general rule, that should be the main strategy for now, right? But if the people are still not willing to be vaccinated, then perhaps we can consider mandatory vaccination down the line. And the reason I say this is because mandatory vaccination will come along with a high implementation cost. How are we going to ensure that 75% of Malaysians are vaccinated? Is the government going to send public officers to hold our hands to the clinic kesihatan? That's going to cost a lot of money. And this money will be double if we need double doses of vaccines, right?
Right.
And what about the people in the interior?
Yeah, that's challenges there for sure. Harris, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but we will be back with more on this topic, so stay tuned to Consider This. Thank you so much for staying with us on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about vaccine hesitancy and the reasons underlying it. Joining us now, we have Ustaz Dr Nurul Haq Shahrir. He's a consultant on religion for the United Nations in Malaysia. Good evening, Nurul Haq. Now, I want to begin by asking you whether you yourself have seen or observed many Muslims displaying vaccine hesitancy, and what are some of the reasons behind it?
Yes, from my observation, there have been some reservations among Muslims. This is what I read from Facebook and social media. I think the main reason is the substance, the main ingredient used in developing the vaccine. And the main concern of the Muslim is, of course, porcine or the non-halal questionable substance.
Yeah, so how do we address that? I mean, what exactly is now the leadership within the Muslim community saying? I mean, these are the reservations being circulated. How do you, as somebody who is also a religious leader, thinking through the issue?
Okay, first of all, the Special Muzakara Committee, commonly known as the National Fatwa Council, they convened on the 3rd of December recently to discuss on the issue of vaccine for COVID. And they did not reveal the consensus. However, from the recent statement of the Mufti of Kedah, Dr. Sheikh Fazil Awam, seems to indicate that they agree on the permissibility of the vaccine, because in his words that the vaccine does not contain any animal substance, or it is not sourced from animals. So the issue of halal is obviated according to the research of the National Fatwa Council. And Muslims in Malaysia must always seek the guidance of the Ministry of Health when it comes to issues like this, and the Department of State Muslims. So we must be guided by the fatwa and whatever conclusions have been made by the Ministry of Health.
Nurul Haq, could I get you to clarify, did you say that there is not yet a consensus on this?
No, there is a consensus, but the Minister in charge of Religious Affairs, Dr. Zulkifli Al-Bakri, did not reveal the consensus because the Council is waiting for the royal assent from the Yang di-Pertuan Agong on the matter.
I see.
They have discussed the matter, and now it's waiting for royal assent.
Right. Does that settle it for the Muslim community? Is it so easy? You have a fatwa council, it makes a decision, and everybody falls into line? Or do reservations have a deeper resonance that perhaps is there trust issues, that we see this with others, maybe not without religious basis, but they have other reasons for doubting a vaccine. They doubt the motives of big pharmaceutical companies, they doubt the motives of government, they perhaps see conspiracies, and therefore evidence doesn't necessarily change their minds. Will a fatwa itself be convincing for those who have reservations?
I believe it is. I mean, the fatwa must be effectively promulgated. It must be the outcome of the fatwa must be made available to public to dispel any doubt, any misgiving about the fatwa. Okay, and since according to the Mufti of Kedah, there is no it is not sourced from animal. There is no animal substance in the vaccine. So the question of porcine or any non-halal substance like alcoholic substances should not appear.
Okay. Nurul Haq, I wanted to ask you whether we should make a distinction that this is a time of a pandemic. I mean, are there special considerations in times of emergencies, whereas Islamic jurisprudence say that perhaps emergencies make the forbidden permissible?
Yes. In Shafi'i school of thought, in the Shafi'i right or mazhab in Arabic, we call it, which is a de facto mazhab of Malaysia, there is this, what we call this fixed maxim, jurisprudential maxim, we call it istiqlaq. Okay? So let's assume that the vaccine does contain questionable substance. Okay? So under this maxim, okay, the substance that has been obliterated during the development of the vaccine, it has been obliterated by other halal substance. Okay, it has gone through the process of purification. I mean, each vaccine has to go through the process of purification, and in the case of COVID vaccine, if I'm not mistaken, the purification process is called liquid chromatography. So this process obliterates the questionable substance. Let's say if it's porcine, the greater amount of the halal substance obliterates the minute amount of the questionable porcine substance. So as if it does not exist. Okay, this maxim, it is called istiqlaq. Okay, and in fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, the scholars of jurisprudence, the jurists, they have brought a few instances of istiqlaq. For example, in the Nihayah of Imam Al-Ramli, right, he did mention that, for example, a small piece of human flesh falling into a pot of meat while you are cooking it, okay? Because human flesh, you cannot consume human flesh. It is considered under questionable substance. So the fact that the small piece of human flesh fall into a pot of meat does not make eating the entirety unlawful, right, because the qualities of that human flesh or questionable substance were obliterated by the greater amount of the halal substance, as if there is no existence of it.
Ustaz Nurul Haq, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight and providing us some clarity onto the matter. Thank you for your time. Yeah. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching and good night.